Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to somebody who was recommended to me by our common acquaintance, Ambassador Chas Freeman. I'm talking to Mr. Graham Fuller, who used to work for the CIA, and I would like to talk to him about this link between intelligence agencies on the one hand and US foreign policy on the other. And Mr. Fuller is uniquely qualified for this because he was working for 25 years for the agency. And after that, shortly before 2000, he left the agency. Then he worked for the Rand Corporation. And he has been working with and for intelligence during the Cold War, which gives him a very unique insight also in the development of these intelligence agencies. Mr. Fuller was working in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, Afghanistan, and Hong Kong, after which he then became an analyst for the agency. So, Graham Fuller, thank you very much for taking the time for talking to me today.
My pleasure, Pascal.
Graham, let me maybe start with a question from your CV. You write there that you were an operations officer when you were in the field. Can you describe to us what an operations officer is, what he does, and connected to that, what did you do in the CIA?
Sure. Well, briefly, the CIA is divided into two sections. One is operations, and the other is analytical analysis. The operations side is classic espionage, just as every major power in the world has espionage organizations, US, UK, France, Germany, Russia, China, maybe even Switzerland, who knows. And in classic espionage operations, you're essentially trying to recruit people who will provide you with information, classified information, secretly, because it's illegal for them to do so, and are reporting to you on matters of interest to your government. So I was in the business of either already handling spies. Handling means simply meeting with them secretly, out of the way, discreetly, clandestinely, if you want to use a fancy word, but meeting with them confidentially, and receiving reports, sometimes written materials, sometimes documents, sometimes simply their reporting on what was going on, let's say, in the Ministry of Defense or in the Ministry of Intelligence or Foreign Office or whatever else. So so an operations officer is the person who is essentially handling, if you will, running, operating these espionage agents, who are, of course, of secret, because what those agents are doing is illegal. The other half of the agency essentially is the analytical side, and their job is to analyze the information that's being sent from the field and put it into a broader context and send it to policymakers.
So you were essentially engaged in all of these secret operations that are the material for movies. Are you still under any requirements to keep secrets at the moment, or after your contract is over, are you free to divulge information?
Well, first of all, just let me say, I think to understand what the intelligence officer is doing is, of course, in itself classified work, but it's very well understood work around the world, and most major countries are engaged in such things, whether they do it well or not well, or whether they accurately analyze the information that the CIA officers are sending back in their reports, their agent reports from the field. that's a major question in itself. Yes, I mean, I've been out of CIA now for 30 years. Any former CIA officers required not to reveal classified information. But after a long time, there's not very much classified information that is not known. I mean, every diplomat, many intelligence officers speak in very general terms. So nobody is going to say, "Oh yes, my agent in the French Foreign Ministry was Mr. So and so." That obviously is very classified. But to say, the CIA was extremely interested in how the French would handle their policies in Africa, let's say, is you don't have to be very brilliant to understand that would be a normal question against which to collect information.
So, Switzerland also has an intelligence agency. They're called the Nachrichtendienst, the news agency, and they're not famous. And I guess that's a good thing for an intelligence organization. Now, in the case of the United States, you have the most famous intelligence agencies of the world, the CIA. I guess the FBI also counts. And you have about 18 or 19 different intelligence services that have like specific tasks, but the CIA is definitely the most famous one, and in my quarters of the internet also the most notorious one for looked at as part of the deep state that doesn't change, with little to no accountability to elected politicians, and that shapes US foreign policy. How much of this reputation do you think is well-deserved, and what about it would you correct in terms of public perception?
Well, I think it really depends very much on the time period that we have under discussion. This whole situation, the role of the CIA, it's called the Central Intelligence Agency simply because it was viewed as the central clearinghouse for all other foreign intelligence information, whether it comes from military intelligence sources or other technical sources. And technically, the CIA was the central intelligence agency, which would be the final center for analysis of all these various different sources of information. But anyway, I think it really depends very much on the period of time that we are talking about. I think there are a great many myths about CIA, naturally, because it's very exotic. It's romantic, if you will, all this kind of thing. But it depends. First of all, I think it's a mistake to consider that the CIA is out of control or independent. But it really depends. The CIA reports to the president, and it does what the president wants. So the idea that CIA is out there sometimes overthrowing governments because it decided it wanted to do that is utter nonsense. It doesn't do those things unless it is ordered by the president to do those things. That's called covert action. Covert action is a little different. That's actually making things happen politically, overthrowing governments or starting small, conflicts or something like that. That's covert action. But the classic intelligence brief, the collection of intelligence, that goes on more or less automatically. But the president is the one who decides whether he or she will use the CIA for political ends, for operational purposes, to change governments or change policies overseas.
So the charge is that there are moments when even your parliament, I mean, when the House cannot get answers from the directors of the CIA because the director says, "I'm sorry, this is classified, this is secret, this is so secret we cannot even let the most important body, right, the elected officials, and not only the president is elected, right, the parliament, all parliamentarians, House and Senate are elected. And the legislative branch is usually viewed as the most important embodiment of the people, right? and has oversight. There's these oversight committees, and when even the CIA doesn't answer and says like, okay, we're not going to give you the documents. For instance, one of the recent things that happened is, of course, that the CIA refuses, or the FBI, now I don't know which one anymore, to release all of the documents connected to the Kennedy assassination, which is the fabric of a lot of theories about this internal, probably being an inside job. So is the CIA not subject to control by the legislative branch?
It does not respond to the legislative branch. That is not its function. It responds to the executive branch, which is the president. Now, there are, you call it parliamentary or congressional committees, which have oversight over intelligence affairs, and they are regularly briefed by the CIA, by the chief of the CIA in most cases, as to activities that are going on. Sometimes there's the CIA speculation on what's going on in the world, its various approaches, but it would be inaccurate to say that there is no congressional oversight. Sometimes the president might say to CIA, you will not discuss this issue or that issue with Congress. That's the president's determination. He appoints the chief of Central Intelligence, the director of CIA. He makes that appointment, and the director of CIA is responsible to the president first and foremost. But yes, he should, or she, respond to Senate or House congressional queries, but it's always with the support and blessing and control of the president.
So are you overall over your career and also beyond your career, you are satisfied with the level of civilian control over this very, very crucial security body of the US?
That's an interesting question, Pascal, because I'm not content with what I would see. My discontent has nothing to do whether there is civilian oversight or not civilian oversight. I think there is, there is no other kind of oversight that would exist except civilian oversight. Mm-hmm. But the problem is I distrust the civilian oversight. I increasingly distrust policymakers, both in congressional and in the State Department and elsewhere who are making policy, including the president and the National Security Council, who I think are often not paying attention to serious intelligence reporting. They ignore it. I would say that they are not, their policy formulation does not reflect very often the reality that perhaps CIA itself is giving and forwarding to the president. But this is a very interesting thing. When I think that for most junior CIA officers, the baptism by fire, if you will, is when you first go overseas and you have this belief that if you have good agents reporting to you, and you have good reporting, and you do some good analysis of this reporting that you get in the field, all you have to do is send it back to Washington, and then everything else takes care of itself, and people read it and say, okay, now we understand, now we will do this, and we won't do that. I think the moment of loss of innocence is when you begin to realize as a CIA officer that maybe a great deal of these reports are not being read, or some of them may be very unpopular with the president or with the policymakers or with the State Department or with the Pentagon. Or that maybe there's not a lot of interest perhaps in hearing this. In theory, the CIA's, to me, most positive function is that it has no responsibility except to report what it believes is happening in the field. Let's put aside covert action, because that's a very special thing when you get in and try to influence governments, or even in cases overthrowing other governments. That's at the president's command to do those things. I'm talking about classical intelligence collection. There is the feeling that in many ways this is almost seemingly irrelevant, that the intelligence officers are not being listened to. If the White House has a particular policy, let's say towards Ukraine or Russia or China, and the CIA, both the reporting from the field, from the operations officers and the analysts back home who are working with that material, are, let's say, sending material that the White House doesn't like because it contradicts what the White House or the State Department thinks that it's doing. So quite often there can be some kind of clash or real tension between what the CIA believes is its best reporting and what the State Department wants to do. The CIA basically has no policy-making function whatsoever, and that's very important. Contrary to charges that the CIA is running around overthrowing governments and nobody knows about it, that's utter nonsense. If the CIA is overthrowing a government somewhere, you can be damn sure that the president told it to do those particular things. So there is this tension between let's say reporting good intelligence and whether policymakers in foreign policy or Pentagon are going to take that information seriously and act upon it. And often they don't like to hear it. If you go and say, Mr. President, I'm sorry, but our policy towards China is indicating that this is happening, or in Ukraine, let's just take a theoretical case in Ukraine and saying, Mr. President, our analysis is that contrary to the New York Times, the Ukrainians are not winning the war, but on the contrary, Russia is winning the war. The president does not want to hear this. The New York Times, who doesn't read these reports anyway, doesn't want to hear this. There's a whole industry of the executive policy making that does not want to hear unwelcome news that suggests that the policy is not very good. So that's the kind of inherent tension, which I think is very valuable. In theory, there's no other organization in Washington that is committed to reporting the facts as it sees it and has no other obligation. The military has to win wars. The State Department has to promote policies with other countries and get them to do certain things. The CIA has only responsibilities to say, Mr. President, or what other readers there are of this analysis, this is what we believe is happening. Like it or not, that's our best view.
That's interesting, because what you're saying is that the CIA is not a politicized body, or should not be a politicized body, right? But what we've seen over at least the last 20 years is politicians using the name of the CIA as a justification for XYZ to happen, and later on turns out this was completely wrong. I mean, the most egregious example is, of course, the justification for the Iraq War, where the whole spiel was to say that the intelligence agencies told us that there are weapons of mass destruction, therefore we have to invade Iraq. Mr. Fuller, are you back?
Yes, I am. I lost you for about 30 or 40 seconds.
Yeah, sorry. You
were talking about the Iraq War, and let me just make a few quick comments about that. First of all, the CIA absolutely has no policy formulating function. It is contrary to the charter of the CIA to make policy. It is its entire goal is to provide intelligence on international events. You can see that, I mean, this is a very basic sense of wisdom. If the CIA is both reporting intelligence and then saying, Mr. President, we should do X, Y, or Z, and then it turns out that X, Y, or Z was a very bad suggestion, then the chief of CIA will come to the president, and he will probably not want to report that information, which makes the CIA chief himself look bad because he had recommended that course of action. The CIA chief should be absolutely independent of any policy making, and if the president says, "What do you think I should do?" a proper chief of CIA should say, "Mr. President, that is not my job. My job is to tell you what I think is happening." So when it came to the Iraq War, for example, this is a very important case. We had people like Dick Cheney, who was the vice president of the country, a huge war hawk, all kinds of other war hawks in the policymaking organization. They were determined to prove that there was weapons of mass destruction. And not only did CIA, I was not there at the time, this was long after I had left, but I've read about it, you may have read about it as well. The CIA reported that as far as they knew, there were no weapons of mass destruction. Dick Cheney actually personally came out to CIA to talk to junior officers in their offices and say, "We want you to look over this again. I don't think you're getting the message. You don't understand the problem, blah, 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 blah." You can imagine the power of the vice president of the United States coming in and talking to a junior analyst. These are analysts we're talking about now. And trying to put heavy pressure to change and modify these intelligence reports that Cheney didn't like, the president didn't like, the State Department didn't like, because they were committed to war. So that is one of the most egregious cases of all. I don't know, I forget exactly even how it all ended up. Probably the chief of CIA himself was, I should say, was somewhat corrupted, because he was brought in. This was George Tenet, I believe, at the time, and was asked by the president, "Do you think we should do this, or what do you recommend we do?" And he was so happy to be brought into the secret, policy making thing, that he gave his advice. It was very bad advice, and it was wrong advice, and he should have given no advice whatsoever, because that's against his job description. But he did give advice. And as a result, the Washington went off to war when all kinds of analysts said, "It's foolish, it's dangerous, and don't do it." And people outside the CIA also said the same thing. But, this is the problem. When you have heavy political appointees appointed to be the director of CIA, they may feel that they're very beholden to the president. They want to be close to the president. They want to be close to power. So it takes a certain degree of integrity on the part of the director of CIA to say, "That's not my job. I report to you on what we believe is happening. We will answer questions, but we will not recommend policy. If I recommend policy, I become part of that process and become thereby drawn into it and corrupted."
That's a good observation, but I would like also to ask about this function in the public eye. So the CIA and intelligence organizations in the US are often used by politicians as justifications. We have now also this infamous case of Joe Biden basically asking the directors of the intelligence agencies to write him a letter saying, like, "No, the Hunter Biden laptop is disinformation from Russia." Then they do that, and then he uses that for political purposes, saying like, "Oh, look, all of these agencies actually say that no, it's Russian disinformation." Turns out, no, it wasn't. But this is like this abuse of intelligence, right, and also of trust in these agencies. And on the other hand, we constantly now in the mainstream press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, we get these leaks from undisclosed intelligence officers who say this, who say that, and of course their names cannot be made public. And obviously this is done on the behest of the political agenda in order to form a narrative. That's why people like that's why a lot of the online community, they just don't trust this stuff anymore, because it's obviously wrong, because the real leakers are in Belmarsh prison, right? The Julian Assanges, those people who leak real information that is actually damaging to the image of the US and the deep state itself. When you were an officer of the CIA, was that already the case, or is this a new phenomenon?
I think the intelligence organizations have been increasingly corrupted over the years. I left CIA in, I don't know, 1987, I think, after 25 years, serving as I said, both as an operations officer in many different foreign countries, and as I was responsible for the last 5 years for long-term forecasting at the CIA, called National Intelligence Estimates. I believe that there has been a general trend towards corruption of the intelligence organizations and politicization of the intelligence organizations in Washington, particularly, let's say, after 9/11. After 9/11, I don't know, I don't have the statistics at hand, but I believe the CIA was tripled or quadrupled in size. Entirely new intelligence organizations, such as the Department of Homeland Security, which is a term that sounds like it's out of the Third Reich. The word Homeland Security never existed before. Heimatsecurität or Nachrichten, or whatever you want to call it. So the entire intelligence community was vastly expanded. The military side, the civilian side, the CIA side, new organizations, and I think this led generally to a corruption and let's say what's the word I'm looking for? A kind of weakening and dilution, if you will, of the qualities that the CIA had previously had before. I don't want to suggest that everything was perfect or always worked right. It wasn't. I mean, it's a human organization, and power inevitably corrupts anywhere, any organization. But I think after 9/11, these organizations became so huge, and the people appointed to be head of CIA became increasingly heavily political organizations. Even when I was there, when I was finally at my highest position as the chief of long-range forecasting, the William Casey was the director of CIA, appointed by Ronald Reagan. William Casey was a brilliant man, a very interesting, perceptive analyst of what's going on in the world, but also deeply political, deeply committed on the right wing of American politics and American understanding of foreign policy. So here you have this man representing all of CIA, and a very intelligent man on top of it, advising the president. Already, I think we see some corruption of the system there when he was brought into the White House to advise the president on policy. So I think this is a long-term, constant problem to avoid and protect the CIA against politicization, and it has only been partially successful, and I think is far, far worse now than it has been in a very, very long time, including, I mean, I think on the Hunter Biden laptop issue and the issue of Donald Trump and Russian ties, I think the people who were speaking up were primarily former directors of the Defense Intelligence Agency or the CIA, and not actually active members anymore. But that's still unacceptable in my view. It's a politicization and corruption of that whole thing. And the New York Times plays along with this 100%. The New York Times loves these leaks because it seems authoritative, and the New York Times can say, we've got this, exclusive story. It may be only half the story. It may be a quarter of the story. It may not even be very accurate, but it's the story that the New York Times wants, the narrative that the New York Times wants to project, which is why you have the New York Times for now 2 years telling the American public every single day that Russia is losing the war and Ukraine is winning the war. So I think, and the Washington Post equally much so. The United States, when we talk about the corruption of intelligence, I think the ability of the United States, especially as we have seen during this Ukraine war, has become terrifyingly clear that the ability of the American government to control and dominate not just the American mainstream media, but the global media. Mm-hmm. If you look at the European media, I'm not sure I even try. I mean, BBC, forget about it. Lots of the British press, forget about it. Der Spiegel, or maybe NZZ is still perhaps halfway independent, but the United States has been able to control this narrative very, very powerfully, and control of narrative today is what it's all about. And you go from the intelligence field into the control of the narrative. And that's the story of contemporary foreign policy in the United States.
That's exactly what we need to understand. That's exactly what I would like to know from you. So we have this problem that we are being propagandized, so we cannot trust this. And European media is like tickle-down media, right? They look at what the New York Times writes, and then that must be correct because they know Washington, etc. So therefore they go along. Like, it's beautiful, like how this narrative then blooms. But for anyone who wants to understand this, my single largest question is the people in power, the people who then make the decisions. Do they believe the BS that they feed to the general public, or do they know better? And I think, if I understand you correctly, you're saying no, Pascal, the CIA informs these decision makers of what's actually happening, and then they take decisions based on that, and then they feed another narrative to the general public, because that's important to back them up, which would put my mind at ease if that's the case, because if they at least know what's going on, that makes it better than if they believe their own BS.
Well, I don't think it's a black or white situation in that direct case. I mean, you can imagine if you have been appointed chief of CIA, and by the way, I have great regard for the present chief of CIA, who is a deeply experienced man, unlike this amateur hour group, American, Secretary of State and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, all these people who I think are strict amateurs with no diplomatic experience whatsoever. William Burns, who was appointed chief of CIA, really knows what he's talking about. He has served as a diplomat. He's worked in Russia for many years. He's met with Putin many times over those years. So I have a lot of regard for him, and the fact that he was recently brought into the cabinet, which in theory is not so good because the chief of CIA shouldn't be that close to policy making. But I sense that even Biden maybe senses that things are going very badly wrong in Ukraine, and he wants to get somebody who's reliable. But put yourself, Pascal, in the position of, let's say, that any chief of CIA, especially if you're appointed by the president, and you see that the president's policies are not working and things are getting worse and worse. Are you going to and say, Mr. President, I'm sorry, the policy is a disaster. You don't know what you're doing. You should change whatever he says. That's very difficult. Even if you have the power of the chief of CIA, you're going to be a little bit cautious about what you tell the president, depending on the president's own politics, the personality of the president. Do you think you can influence the president at all in these issues? Do you want to influence the president, or do you want to, as George Tenet, who was the director of CIA during the Iraq War, you want to tell the president what he wants to hear because it strengthens your own access to the president?
But in your honest opinion, do you believe that Joe Biden is the one who makes the decisions? Because I am not sure anymore about his. I mean, I seriously, I just don't. I'm not sure he can process all of that.
I agree with you. No, I think he maybe has a few basic ideas, a few basic beliefs. The man is, nearly 80 or 80 years old, whatever. And what he remembers and knows about the world goes back 80 years of his understanding of the world. But no, I think it is more the national security team around him that has been, who are basically neoconservatives, neocons, all of them, until the arrival of William Burns as the chief of CIA, who playing an indirect role now in that policy process. So I think that the Secretary of State, I'm lying, but I'm going to do this anyway on television. I think, you want to put the best face forward you can. You want to make the best case you can. And so I guess that's why you choose the best facts, the best face for the policy that you're presenting. Whereas in theory, the CIA should not just put the best face, it should give a balanced sense of the pros and the cons of whether the policy is working or not. But it's not a matter of explicitly lying. Maybe hiding some facts, that's possible. For sure, possible.
Yeah, so the question to me is this decision-making process inside the United States, because you're saying in theory, CIA gives information, president takes it, thinks about it, and then takes a decision, and then it's being executed. That's good foreign policy making. In reality, we know this must be working differently, because don't get me wrong, I do think spying is very, very valuable for international relations. Good spying, good intelligence in Washington, in Moscow, in Tokyo, in Brussels, that should be, the good information should be the basis for policy making, and that needs to happen based on good spying. When spying services fail, then you have moments like in Japan in the Second World War, where the Japanese were unaware of the fact that Stalin in Yalta decided to enter the war 3 months before the atomic bomb was dropped on them. Had they known that Stalin had decided to join the war, the decision-making process would have been different. And maybe Hiroshima and Nagasaki could have been averted because the Japanese already had known that this thing is gone, right? Grand strategically. So good spying is very important now, but if that spying and if those informations don't get to the right places, or if these places then abuse that information for their own political purposes, it's rendered useless. And that's getting worse, you're saying, right? This making policy based on what we want.
I think it depends on the policy. If the policy is, let's say, a good policy and it's working, and the CIA comes in and says the policy is working from our information, that's good. But if the CIA comes in and says, I'm sorry, but our information seems to be that the policy is not working, then that's a very different thing. Then you can say, well, the CIA is prejudiced, or they don't know the whole story, or, I'm smarter than the CIA is, or my gut instinct. And Biden loves to talk about, his gut instincts and all of this kind of thing. No, I agree with you. I think clandestine intelligence is very important, but I would say also, Pascal, it is not the whole story. And in fact, I might say that more important is open source intelligence. And I've been much more interested in the whole question of open source intelligence after leaving the CIA. Even in my last few years at CIA, I was partly responsible responsible for having a chance to go out and talk to prominent people in business field, newspaper people, intellectuals, whatever, in academics, to ask them their opinion, to help formulate our thinking in putting together these long-range forecasting things. So I came to have a lot of respect for people who have no access to any secret information whatsoever, but still have maybe extremely precise, or precise is not the best word, accurate, perceptive, that's the important word, perceptive views of what is going on in the world. So I have long been an advocate, and I think CIA has maybe played around with this a little bit. I don't know what the status of it is. I don't follow intelligence affairs that much anymore, but to create an institution which would have no access to intelligence information, but which would look at open source information from around the world, anything unclassified, and then draw their policy formulate, not policy formulations, but their characterization, their description of what they think is going on in the world today and in the future. I mean, a lot of it, I'm sorry to go on this subject, but I think we've touched on a very critical thing here. Just because information is secret doesn't mean it's good.
Mm-hmm.
It could be brilliant, it could not be good. If you have somebody who's a spy, let's say, who's sitting in a particular office, and let's say in Moscow or Beijing or New Delhi or Paris or Bonn or whatever, they may have secret information and access, but it may be only a very limited picture of the whole thing. So can you rely on that spy's accurate but limited? Or do you understand how limited that should be? And more than that, even, I would say, I think the ability of senior policymakers to understand the mentality, personally, to understand the mentality of the opposition, if you will, the enemy, if you will, the competitor, if you will. If I were president of the world, I would make it mandatory that every 3 months that the two major powers of the world leaders would have to sit down and spend a weekend with each other and have a barbecue outdoors and drink beer and talk about their families and talk about their lives and everything else and talk about policy, but for 2 days, 48 hours over beer and hamburgers, to get a sense of the personality who they're dealing with. This is very vital. I mean, I don't know whether you remember back when Ronald Reagan, you're too young, but back when Ronald Reagan was president, he apparently was quite taken aback when he spent I don't know what the circumstances were, but he spent quite a bit of time with Gorbachev, personally, one-on-one, and came away with a rather changed view of Gorbachev and believed that it would be possible for the United States to reach some kind of accommodation with the Soviet Union. And when Ronald Reagan, who was not an intellectual, maybe he had good Fingerspitzengefühl for people, but he was not an intellectual, he was not an analyst, but he came out of this meeting and his top advisors were horrified because Reagan basically said, I think we can work with these people. I think we can maybe make a deal. I mean, Gorbachev cares about his grandchildren and I care about my, I'm oversimplifying. What I'm trying to say is, if you don't have a feel for the mentality, if you don't have a empathy for the person and the state and the culture that you're talking with, you're not going to get it right. I don't care if you've got secret, spy satellites saying that they're going to launch these aircraft or fire these missiles. Okay, maybe that's important to know, but it's not what really matters. It's the feel for the political culture and a feel for the leadership on a empathetic basis. That's how you understand what they're going to do. That's why William Burns, who was ambassador to Moscow, now CIA chief, had written in his memoir that he had opposed the expansion of NATO to Ukraine because he said this would be a very bad mistake. And I think his words were the reddest of red lines for the Kremlin.
And it's not only in his memoirs, he wrote a memo in 2009 when he was ambassador entitled "Niet means Niet." This was known. I mean, this was supported to the US government and to the other decision-making centers, and they decided to go along anyhow because that's the policy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you can see, I think, this question of empathetic understanding. I'm not saying sympathy, it's empathy, which, and there's a very big difference. It means you can put yourself in the shoes of Putin, of Xi Jinping, of Modi or Macron or, you know, Scholte or whoever, and understand what is driving these people, what is driving German culture, or German political culture, or Ukrainian culture. This does not come with necessarily with secret information at all.
No, that's absolutely true. And what you're talking about, I usually call that strategic empathy, trying to understand what the world looks like from the perspective of your opponent. And in order to do that, you of course need to know what's going on in their circles. That's why you need good intelligence information in order to do that. But we are, at least in the public eye, we are seeing now the opposite. But that's also a mechanism of war. You know, war is a sociological phenomenon, and one of the mechanisms of that is to break down personal links and to break down all empathy for the other party. Only that way you get people ready to go and kill those bastards, right? Because they're beasts, they're animals. We cannot talk to them. Whereas the rationale of peacemaking is the opposite, of recreating these human links in order to understand what the other one's problem is and then find a solution. Right. So we are right now in this spiral, in the war spiral, and this war spiral probably influences the CIA as well, because it's not welcome to get information that doesn't cohere with what you want to do in order to escalate.
Absolutely. And so this is the terrible dilemma of all of this. And I fear that this is, you know, ironically, democracies are even more dangerous than dictatorships or authoritarian governments, because if Xi Jinping, or Putin for that matter, decides that he has a decent understanding of what the situation is, and he will try to formulate policy in those directions. But if you're in a democratic state, you can't just fight in Ukraine. You have to demonize not only the Russian military, you have to, in this case now, it's really terrifying, you have to demonize everything Russian. You have to ban Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in universities. You have to send the Russian ballerinas home. You have to send the Moscow Symphonic Orchestra, Philharmonic Orchestra back to Moscow. Nothing Russian. It's all bad. You have to do that in a democracy to get everybody on board of, yes, we hate the enemy. They're vicious. They're, you know, all this kind of things. Democracies are more dangerous in that regard than authoritarian governments.
True. A dictator doesn't need to care.
Yeah, I mean, a bad authoritarian government can be very dangerous. A stupid, a mindless authoritarian government can be even more dangerous, I suppose. But if it's an intelligent one, you don't have to whip the entire public into some war frenzy. I can't believe it. I mean, I was a CIA officer. I speak Russian fluently. I studied Russian it wasn't because of CIA. I studied it in university for years, and I lived with a Russian family in Boston, Massachusetts. So why am I mentioning this? During the whole Cold War period, when the Soviet Union was the enemy in communism, I never saw this demonization of Russia, of Russian culture, like it has happened after the end of the Cold War and this war in Ukraine. It's quite terrifying. And it suggests now, since just in the last 10, 15 years, the ability of central governments like the United States to dominate and control the narrative, which is why you can't even trust the New York Times at all on many, many subjects. I don't even want to hear what the New York Times anymore has to say about Ukraine or China, or there are some other subjects, they might be more interesting on. But when it comes to very highly politicized issues, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, I don't know where it comes from, whether it's corporate power, corporate influence, whatever it is, they have their clear marching orders. And I have a standing bet with many friends that I will pay them $100 if they will once give me an article from the New York Times that presents an interestingly nuanced, balanced perception of what's going on in Russia or what Putin is about. It's just nonstop drumbeat negative. That's scary.
The reason why I read the New York Times daily is because during the Soviet era, one of the only ways that academics had to actually figure out what's going on in the Soviet state is by following the Pravdas and so on, because you know that what they write is government sanctioned. So you don't know what's going on inside, but you know that what's coming out, you can study that and analyze that. And I use that now for the United States, knowing that's what's in the New York Times and Washington Post, that those things are like 80-85% surely okayed with the establishment, so I can figure out what the establishment wants to feed us, right, and wants the people to believe. So we can use that. That's very limited, but that's about it, which is a very sad moment. And I do think we are at a very ideological moment of the West, which is highly dangerous. And I do hope that the CIA still has good intelligence officers on the inside like you.
Well, there are some very good officers. There's some bad officers. There's some mediocre officers. But at least I would say in maybe, I don't know what the proportion is, 30-40% of the cases, you do have case officers who have been trained in foreign languages. And if you live in the country, it's very difficult to hate it unless you have no contact whatsoever with the local people. So by definition, I think perhaps the CIA case officer working in another country is forced by circumstances to have a greater human empathy towards the people around them and how they think and how they act, and that's really important. But otherwise, I mean, I fear this is the ideologization of Western policy increasingly. And for a long time, I looked to Europe as perhaps the savior of the West, that it would provide a sort of balanced picture that would help keep the US a little more in balance. But that has now completely disappeared from the scope. I don't even fully understand all the reasons. I keep asking my European friends, why is this happening? And there's no really good answer. But it's as if the entire European press, there are some exceptions. I mean, as in the US, there's some very small groups, small websites, which are very good. But by and large, they have fallen now into the same trap. They don't want to contradict Washington or the Washington narrative. And NATO is European foreign policy. It took me a long time to realize that, but I used to think that Europe had its own independent sort of foreign policy. That's just not the case. NATO is European foreign policy. Period.
Yeah.
Look at a guy like Olaf Scholz.
He's the worst. He's the worst. He stands next to the US president while the US president says we're going to end your infrastructure project whenever we like it, and he just nods there. It's like, right. That's not. I mean, the Europe is at the very short leash politically and ideologically. They are even happier to be even closer, and so there's some weird mind eating ideological bug going on that then makes these people in newspaper rooms and so on just go along, and the world must be what the New York Times says, because the New York Times is the paper of reference. Blah 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 blah. So
exactly.
it's lockstep. It's this lockstep phenomenon that is getting tighter and tighter, and that's so dangerous.
Well, and on top of that, I must say I was horrified. Usually when I think of green parties, I think of parties that have, a sense of compassion about the environment and understanding of the human condition, and generally speaking, anti-war. I will make a very sexist remark here by saying that I would expect more of women politicians than I would of men, because I think women maybe have a little more human sensitivity, in my view. I may be wrong, but I was shocked to the degree to which the German left, I'm not the Greens, German Greens, are as warmongers as anywhere in Europe.
They're even worse.
Shockingly so. Shockingly so. Not Die Linke. Die Linke seem to have their head screwed on right. But the Greens, I just cannot understand this.
No, I'll tell you this. If Hitler came back, he would immediately join the Greens. Immediately. There's a beautiful book actually written. There's a beautiful book with a title in German, like the Greens, no more war without us. That's the Greens completely transformed from an anti-war party to, as many tanks and as many dead Russians as possible. No de-escalation, no reverse gear. And it's
but even when the economy is tanking, it's dying. Deindustrialization of Germany. Germany has been the biggest single victim, ironically, of this sanctions on Russia.
Yeah,
so
but
I just don't understand what it takes to cause Germans to wake up.
Ideologues don't care. That's the problem. That's why Stalin killed 2 million of his own people in his purges. Ideologues don't care. They will drive on, come what may. And I am very afraid that we have those in Europe and we have them in the United States. And I'm afraid they would be willing to go much further than what they have gone so far if they feel too opposed. I'm very scared of that.
So I mean, I think the other thing that bothers me is there's a great deal of political science, I think, which somehow assumes casually that if you have a great power on this side and a great power over here, that automatically a clash is inevitable. I don't. This seems to be almost common wisdom, if you will, common sense. But I think if you really think about it, there's no reason why large powers have to conflict. There might be actually rivalry in certain areas, but the idea that somehow you're automatically going to go to war because you were two opposite polar powers is extremely dangerous. There's nothing inevitable about war ever, or almost never, and human beings have agency. Leaders have agency. So are we all going to sit around and watch this march towards blindness of World War I, stumbling into sleepwalking into World War I, because it all somehow seems inevitable? This is I think the fundamental challenge of political thinking today is how you can avoid. And it's no great secret. It shouldn't be that complicated. How you can begin to avoid these problems. And my recommendation of an obligatory weekend of leaders spending the entire weekend together over a barbecue and beer and hamburgers to talk is, I think, perhaps the beginning of what might begin to humanize the other side, to make people realize that there are ways to discuss these issues. But simply sending, the American Secretary of State to deliver 15 minutes of insulting remarks in China or vice versa, this is not diplomacy. This is diktat.
No, I completely agree with you. We should start a petition to send Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin to a camp where they have to have burgers together somewhere, I don't know, in Geneva or maybe New Delhi, some neutral place. Just go and spend a weekend together. That would be a good idea. And I would like actually to end the discussion on this positive remark. We need to get more intelligence sharing and discussions going again between the nations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully it will happen, but we humans don't seem to learn very easily. And I see this situation, I see less understanding of the enemy, if you will, than today than there was during the Cold War years. I mean, there were some quite remarkable publications that were published, even by the US government. There was something called Problems of Communism. This was long before your time. Problems of Communism was a very serious semi-academic publication of writing about politics in Hungary and Poland and Russia and China and Romania, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to say this was perfect, but it was written essentially with an empathetic view. How do we understand Poland, Russia, Hungary, and these things? That scarcely exists anymore. You're all just Putin versteher these days, if you dare talk about these things.
And that's what we need to bring back. That's what we have to push for, to bring back strategic empathy for each side and information about how these sides actually take decisions. Graham Fuller, I hope we will talk again in the very near future. Thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. I would be happy to continue the discussion at any point. Good. Take care.
Thank you.